based in Bloomington, Indiana, home of Indiana University, another Big Ten town. And I guess my journey, I was into music and things like that in high school, but the path really kicked off in college. Sort of the first extracurricular that I got involved with my freshman year was student radio. And in my time there, I was a DJ for a few years. I was program director. I was a station manager. And that led me to an internship with Secretly. So I started with Secretly in 2003. I'm coming up on 20 years there. It's my only adult professional employment. Kind of a unique story. So when I started, I was, I think, the 10th employee, including the owners. And now today, across all of our related businesses and affiliates, we're over 200 globally. So I've had the opportunity to see things evolve quite considerably. From, I wasn't there at the very beginning, when it was literally, run out of the founder's mom's basement. But it was still like a pretty small setup when I joined. Everyone was in one building, and now we have offices in Bloomington, New York, Los Angeles, London. We also have staff in Paris, Berlin, Amsterdam, and Sydney. So it's a completely different feel than what it was originally. Early on, my first job was just literally packing boxes. I was a shipping manager. In addition to our labels, we also have a distribution company where we distribute today somewhere in the neighborhood of 70, 80 other independent labels, as well as some other independent artists and direct artist deals. At the time, there were maybe 20 or so labels. And yeah, packing boxes, moved into a role doing retail sales for distribution. So I was calling record shops, Electric Fetus, places like that, and trying to get them to order our records. After a couple of years, I moved into more of a domestic sales and marketing role, working with national accounts, big box accounts like Amazon and Target, Best Buy. At the time, we still had things like Tower Records and Virgin Records, these big national chains. And then I managed the distribution company for a few years before moving over on the label side of things, which is where I've been for the last 11 or so years, where I've been in some version of my current role, managing the projects and operations of the Secretly Group. So maybe what I can do is, Nolan, if this is good, I can give you a little bit of sort of a parallel history for the labels and sort of the businesses and how they've evolved.
Yeah, that would be great, because I think that context would be really helpful, especially like kind of what does an independent group like Secretly look like versus some of these big names that a lot of people probably know of.
Yeah, so like I mentioned before, literally started in a basement. So at the beginning, Secretly Canadian, the label, was founded in 1996 here in Bloomington. The founders were all students, including two brothers, and a couple of them met working in the same like dorm cafeteria together. They all did college radio as well. And it really just started something where, they wanted to put out, some 7-inches, some CDs by local and regional artists they knew. The Chris and Ben Swanson, who were the brothers I mentioned, they grew up in Fargo, North Dakota before moving to Indiana for school. So some of the earlier acts, were either based in Indiana or sort of the region near Fargo. And then when they all graduated, the question they had was sort of how they wanted to make a go of it. I think at the time, a lot of the independent labels they looked up to were based in Chicago. Labels like Touch and Go and Drag City, Bloodshot, some others. And, they kind of had this thought of moving to Chicago. A lot of people that go to IU and up there, I'm sure it's the same thing, with you all. But ultimately, they decided that would be a little bit of, chasing coattails, following other footsteps. And so they decided to do something weird and keep doing it in Bloomington. And at the time, there were other models for that. There were other independent labels, particularly working in like the indie rock and folk space that were, in Midwest and sort of non-major music markets. You've got Emerge Records in North Carolina, sort of in the Triangle. You got Saddle Creek in Omaha. You had Sub Pop sort of in their post-grunge Nirvana phase, but still doing exciting things in Seattle. And so it felt like there was a way to do something different where they were. And a couple of years in, they crossed paths with a guy named Darius Van Arman, who started up his own label around the same time called Jagjaguwar. Darius started Jag when he was a student at UVA in Charlottesville, Virginia. And after getting a couple of years in, he decided he wanted to keep the label going, but he wanted partners. And so the Secretly guys decided to team up with Darius. He moved to Bloomington. Those two labels started working together side by side. That was also where a couple other businesses started, primarily Secretly Distribution. And at the time, distribution was, it was more of like a collective in a lot of ways. It was a lot of small, young independent labels trying to figure out how to survive. And at the time, the music market was still entirely built around physical formats, primarily CDs. And so, the challenge was, how do we get our CDs all over the world? A little label, how do we get people to care? And part of it was just a very simple strength in numbers thing. All these other like-minded small labels, if you have more catalog, you have more releases to talk about, you could get a distributor in the UK, to order from you once a month instead of once every 3 months. You could get a record store to order from you a little bit more often. And that's how that business sort of grew. And at the same time, it was, a business that was a little bit more immediately like financially viable and helped back up the labels as they were growing. And things sort of went from there. I guess this is where I'd shift to sort of talking about the impact that certain artists and records have had in our growth. From the time I started there, things were steadily growing, but there were certain projects that we released that really sort of stress test things and sort of forced us to learn very quickly, to grow with artists. And so I think, some of the earliest examples of that, there's a songwriter named Jason Molina, whose Songs Ohio and Magnolia Electric Company projects were some of the big early Secretly Canadian projects. Those were sort of some of the first that got us any real attention outside of the Midwest. But where things really, really started to break open was in like 2005, 2006. We released an album by Anthony and the Johnsons, which went on to win the Mercury Prize, which is the UK's biggest domestic music prize. And that was a real change in terms of how we had to grow to deal with things internationally. Because a lot of Anthony's audience was primarily in Europe, UK, France, Italy, where we didn't have people on the ground. And we had to really grow quickly to try to remain competitive with, European labels. I'd say the other around the time were the early Sufjan Stevens records, which we did not release on our labels, but were titles that we distributed. And so similarly, they were sort of these big titles that stores and distributors were really excited about. They gave them one more reason to order from us every week or every month, whatever. But it also was a challenge for us working with one of our label partners that we distribute to help them grow in the same way that we were trying to, and make sure that they could, sustain the needs of the artists they work with. And then around 2007, we started a third in-house label called Dead Oceans, which you mentioned before. So the other labels had about a 10-year head start. The reason why we started this third brand was it brought in a new partner, a guy named Phil Waldorf, who had worked at one of the distributed labels that we worked with, but wanted his sort of own thing to invest in. We knew we could work well with him. And then that's where things really started to shift. We started working with Bon Iver, released their first record. And that was really around the time where we made a real push outside of Bloomington. At this point, everything was still here in Indiana, but in 2010, we opened our Brooklyn office. A couple years later, we really started to build out our London office. And the sort of logic there was, when we worked with Bon Iver, it was one of several records that we didn't release globally. We were only the partner for North America. And there were other labels involved in releasing the record in other parts of the world. And our goal was that by the time it came for us to re-up our deal with Bon Iver, we wanted to go to them and say, hey, we can release your records globally. We want to be a global partner. This is the type of business we want to have. This is the type of label that we want to have. And we wanted to be able to look them in the eye and with a straight face say, we can handle that. And so we invested a lot in staff in London. It was a case where, in Bloomington, a lot of our staff was really homegrown, people who were not necessarily, music business majors or on any like clear professional track. People like myself who sort of fell into it, in this small Midwest college town. I think as we expanded our London office, that was one of the first instances where, we started to blend in people with other experience in the industry, people with outside experience, who knew different fields, knew different markets, and could really help us expand. And while we were waiting for that next Bon Iver record to come around, we released a record by a band called The War on Drugs, called Lost in the Dream. That was our first gold record in the UK. And that was sort of our proof of concept, that we could do that. And I'll kind of run through the 10 years or so since then. The labels have continued to grow. The scale of artists that we work with has continued to grow, but we've also diversified our businesses further. We opened a publishing company, music publishing company. We started partnering more heavily with certain labels, including one called Numero Group, which is a reissue label based in Chicago. So that put us into a slightly different space. And then in the last couple of years, we launched an entirely new label group. So alongside Secret Group, which is these 4 labels, including Saddest Factory, which is our partnership with Phoebe Bridgers, we launched this entirely new label group called All Flowers Group, that is headlined by a label originally founded in Ann Arbor, Michigan, now primarily based in New York, called Ghostly International. We do a lot of electronic leaning stuff, though they've branched more into indie and other sounds in the last like 5-10 years. And then part of that group as well is we launched a new label called Drink Some Water, which is primarily focused on contemporary R&B and hip hop. The co-founder of that we partnered with is a guy named Nigel Mack, who sort of cut his teeth working for major labels doing A&R. Like he signed Kid Cudi to his first deal. Worked with Dram, now known as Shelly. So yeah, that's kind of I don't want to just bore you all with timeline stuff, but that's sort of the evolution of things over the last 25 years for the businesses.
That's awesome. So obviously kind of what you talk about there's a lot of partnerships happening and coming together to make kind of Secretly Group and all the partners what it is today. Is there anything you've learned from that experience that you would say like is beneficial? And like, obviously earlier you said that there's like strength in numbers with this kind of like small business and growing it. But what have you learned from that experience of branching out into all these different fields?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of it is it's community and exchange of ideas. I think particularly since we did not start in a major, media market, we weren't in New York, we weren't in LA, we weren't in London initially. There weren't necessarily other people in our scene that were doing things at the scale maybe that we wanted to do, right? Like there might be people, with a cassette label or whatever else, but there were some other small labels locally, but we were looking for peers, and initially our peers were other labels, other businesses doing things in sort of non-traditional places, and in a very independent fashion. And so I think that part of that was community building, and that's something that is still part of what we do. I mentioned our distribution company works with 70 some labels. Part of that community building is we've done an event for about 15, 16 years that we just call our label summit, where we invite all of these distributed label partners to Bloomington for a few days of meetings and social hangs and things like that. We invite outside third parties like our reps from Apple, our reps from Spotify, YouTube, physical distributors, things like that, in for meetings. And not only is a place for all these labels to kind of compare notes and trade ideas, but it's also an opportunity for us to give, especially smaller labels that we work with, a little bit more direct access to those big partners that they may not have as an easy a time getting on the phone on their own, right? And so I think a lot of it comes down to finding a community so that you don't feel sort of isolated in the business, but part of that too is finding like-minded people. There's a lot of ways to work in this business, and while I have preferences for certain ways over others, there are a lot of ways to do it that may not be our style that are still just fine, and so I think it's really about finding a lane where you can be passionate about what you're working on. It fits with your values, ideally. I don't want to get like hyperbolic about it, but like it is a little different than selling insurance, or whatever, right? Like it's there are certainly like fields where you could make more money than the music industry in certain instances, but also I think especially when you're sort of starting at the beginning, you got to remember that you're working for artists, or at least when you're on the label side, you're working for artists and those are your partners. And the more conscious you are of sort of what you want your ethos to be and what you want your philosophy to be, and the more conscious you are of trying to find like-minded partners, the easier and the more, I guess, enjoyable it's all going to be in the long run.
Yeah, that's good advice. Kind of thinking about how it differs from business, because we had a lot of questions that were like, what does music business look like separate from that? Kind of going back to that, you had mentioned how obviously the way this formed, you kind of fell into it through college radio, which is cool because I think there's, we have Radio K here, and there's probably people on here who are involved already. But going through kind of the questions we got at the start, there were a lot that were like, which major is best for the music business? Is it this one or this one? And it would be great if you could speak to, what it looks like, what it looked like for you, what your major was versus, you ended up here. And I think a lot of people think they need one specific, like a music business major, which the University of Minnesota doesn't offer. So people kind of are wondering, what's best in that category.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's interesting. Like the maybe unsatisfying answer I'll give about myself is I actually didn't finish my degree. Like the irony is I was taking a semester off to figure out my major. And in that time I started an internship and kind of fell into the job. So there's very much an element of right place, right time for me personally. And I've had dozens of conversations with like younger coworkers or people in job interviews and things like that. And, I just have to acknowledge that it's sort of an atypical path. But what I'll say is that, like, when I personally, am doing hiring, looking at resumes, things like that, I personally don't care too much about the major, necessarily, or the specific educational history. I think it's more the skill set and frankly, like, where else people have pursued their interest. I think that, if you've been a musician yourself, that, shows me that there's a little bit of, like, natural passion and like potential empathy and understanding that's a little bit baked in with artists. I think that there are so many ways to get involved locally in scenes. It's like so many people who work for us who did college radio or promoted shows or were in bands or were in the music club or DJ'd or whatever. And, yes, there's a lot of people who will go out and find internships. I do think that that's like, definitely a useful step, to get some on the job experience, to kind of, because it is it is still like a pretty small niche industry in a lot of ways. What I will say though, is that if I could go back in time, I don't necessarily have like a massive regret about not finishing my degree. I do wish I would have taken a few other classes that would have been like tangibly helpful. And so, like, in the absence of a degree program, I think the things I would suggest to be sort of well-rounded, and you may have all kinds of different interests, like maybe you want to work at a label, maybe you want to be a publicist, maybe you want to be a journalist, maybe you want to be an engineer, whatever, promote shows, any number of ways to get involved. But I think, some of these are sort of stock answers for any sort of like entrepreneurial path, but I think, if you're, somewhat like code web literate, if you can like put together like a basic website, basic design skills can't hurt. I think, depending on the type of the side of the business that you want to go into, I think, a basic like intro to business accounting class, can't hurt. I think, in some cases, like an intro to statistics class, can't hurt. A lot of these are things that, like, may already be built into like a liberal arts major or whatever else. But I think, like, those are the things that, when I imagine, if you're trying to start your own thing as a one-person operation, I think that the more self-sufficient you can be early on, and genuinely do it yourself, the more control you have over sort of those early steps, and the less reliant you're going to be upon, third parties who may cost a lot of money or may not be reliable, to someone starting out new, where you may not be at the top of their client list or whatever else. And so I think those are the things that I would recommend, maybe trying to have in your back pocket.
Totally. Well, awesome. I have one more question that I pre-wrote, and then we're going to get into some of these more specific questions that students have submitted. But I was going to ask, I guess, what does your currently kind of your day-to-day look like? What do you do? And then what are some like challenges that you've come across? Or if either that, or like, what is a big achievement that you're proud of in what you've done on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the biggest challenge, and I know this exists in a lot of industries, but is really the quick pace of change. In particular, like the impact of technology on the business. I mean, like, since I was in college and first started thinking about the music industry, right? Like just from like when I was doing college radio, like my senior year in high school, Napster launched. Like my sophomore year in college, Napster was shut down. And the year I started secretly, the iTunes store launched. 2 years after that, YouTube launched. The year after that, Tower Records closed. And a couple of years after that, Virgin Megastores closed. So the physical market, like when I was like in high school, like, it was still like, Britney Spears and NSYNC selling like CDs off the back of like big singles, right? And like you'd buy these like 18-track albums that were just filled with junk because they could fit 80 minutes on a CD, right? And the weird thing is that's kind of come back around with like streaming, where you've got all these like hour and a half long albums, because it's a play to kind of game the economics of the system. But like, and then 2008, like Amazon Music launched. It was the first digital music service without digital rights management, like that like tied digital music files to the person who bought them. That's when Spotify launched, globally. 2011, Spotify US launches. 2015, Apple Music, YouTube Music launched. 2016, TikTok launches, but doesn't really come to the US until 2018. And then obviously, like with every other industry, like the impact of COVID and how that forced people to shift. And so this sounds kind of hilarious in retrospect, but like the first few years of my working, it was a period of decline in the industry because physical sales were going away, CD sales were going away. Like the major labels were freaked out by file sharing. They didn't understand what digital music was yet. And it felt like everything was dying. And I was like, well, shit, I got on the ship as it was sinking, right? And, while there's that period of decline, by the time you got to like, 2009 to 2014, 15, that's where things sort of leveled off. And then since about 2015, the business has been back like industry wide in sort of a growth phase. And so the way we release records, like the strategies, the best practices, the tools we use are just constantly changing. And so I think that like, the biggest challenge is in being comfortable with change and willing to continue learning and having just like an intellectual curiosity and not being paralyzed by that change, not being freaked out by it. And, being in this place of like balancing, the work you're doing in the present with preparing for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that leads really well into a question that someone submitted, which was essentially, what do you think about and how is this impacting your business about artificial intelligence and kind of how there's been a shift from human playlisting or human cataloging to AI or the algorithm, be it TikTok or Spotify playlist. Well, Spotify is still curated, but just other things like that.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. Like, I think without getting immediately into AI, I mean, I think like the power of algorithms, especially with services like Spotify and YouTube, and you see it with TikTok too. There are tools to manipulate it, right? Like it's not, they're not these it's not like AI driven yet, and so there are ways to sort of, it's not foolproof, but there are tactics, I think, to like engage with the algorithm, and it's a different sort of thing. I mean, it's funny, like some artists like embrace it and realize like the role technology plays in what they're doing. Some just kind of joke about it, like I was talking with Ruben Nielsen, the lead singer of one of our bands, Unknown Mortal Orchestra, and just talking about like giving his offering to like the algo gods, so they will bless him with the bounty of streams, right? It's like it feels a little silly sometimes, even as deep as we dive into the data, still remembering that like on the other side of it, generally speaking, there are still human beings with their own listening habits and consumption, and and that despite what we learn about them, people are still making decisions, even as things are like served up to them, and making those decisions a little bit more passive or less obvious. But I think something like AI, I think it's interesting. And at risk of sounding like an old man yelling at clouds, I do think that there's I think there's a naivete to some people who work in AI, for what they think it can be and what it can replace. I think that there is something to art that can be cheaply replicated. I think where we see it right now, most prevalently is with visual art, right? Like, where you've got, people, building AI that can like rip off certain styles of visual art. And so you're like, we don't need someone to design this. We don't need someone to do this anymore. And, it's sort of presented this as like, it's going to save people all this time, right? But it does sort of take the soul out of things a bit, like I saw this, video the other day of this, I don't know, just some random AI bro that like put together this voice modification thing where like he could make himself sound like Kanye as he was rapping, right? And then like was basically like turning it into like a third-rate Kanye song, right? It's like, okay, you can do that, but like, what's the value of that beyond like a cheap buck? And so I think that like it's one of those things that, can AI be useful in helping an engineer in a recording studio set levels? 100%. Could it be useful for like live engineering and adjusting sound to the room? Could you have sensors around the room, to help maximize like the quality of the sound in different parts of the room without having the sound person like wander around every corner of the, like, yes, there are positive applications, but I think like any other industry, it's about harnessing it to help humans do their work better rather than to replace what we're doing. And I think that, particularly in creative spaces, I think there's a real cost to too many shortcuts.
Yeah, that's great. Awesome. I think the next one here, let's see. This is a good one. How do you personally balance being a music fan and being employed in the music industry? Does it take away the sheen? Do you feel burnt out, or do you feel inspired?
I mean, I think it's like anything. There's a little bit of like, once you strip the mystery away and you kind of, see how it all works. Yeah, there's like a hint of cynicism that can come in at moments, but I think honestly, I've worked at the same place for 20 years, which is, I think, less and less common these days. I mean, so I'm pretty inspired by the artists that we work with. I'm inspired by our, continuing to expand the range of sounds and voices that we work with. And that's the thing that keeps things fresh. It's like, there's always something new being made. And I think as long as, you can remain interested in discovering new things, right? Then that can keep that element of, joy and like genuine love involved in it. But yeah, was there a second part of the question? I feel like I'm forgetting something.
No, that's great. It is just an interesting thing thinking about, I think most people going into the music industry or who are looking at it are very interested in music, and it is a good question, like how does it affect? But that's good to hear that it doesn't make you hate music or something like that. Cool. This is a good one. How do you, as someone working in the music industry and as a manager, how do you foster and protect the well-being of the artists you represent?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one that maybe some people don't ask enough. I feel like that's pretty central to why I'm not only still in the business, but also at the same place after 20 years. You know, I talked about all this sort of growth and change, but the thing that's been pretty consistent is the core philosophies have been pretty steady, even though they've had to evolve to a different sense of scale. You know, we work with a lot of artists that say no to things, and we let them say no. You know, I think that like where we are at our best is when we can get on the same wavelength of an artist for what defines success for them and what they want to do. You know, because you know, we work with some more commercially minded artists who are like, yeah, I'll do, you know, a million interviews, I'll tour all year, you know, I'll do all these like kind of weird like things you have to do for radio, record a bunch of liners, go do all this in studio stuff. Yeah, you know, and they'll say yes to everything, you know, and then at the same time, you know, some of our biggest artists, you know, take Bon Iver, for example, says no to a lot. You know, there's certainly like an alternate universe where Bon Iver could be a very different thing, commercially bigger. Justin and his bandmates could have made more money. But, you know, and maybe there's a scenario where that doesn't affect the art. But there are certainly some alternates in like the multiverse or whatever where the art suffers considerably, you know. And so I think it's really just us understanding what the artist wants. And so when they say, hey, sorry about that, hey, I want to be, you know, on the top 40 alternative radio charts, and say, all right, no guarantees, but to get there, it will require you to do X, Y, and Z. Do you want to do those things? They're like, no. It's like, okay, well, maybe let's adjust the goal then, right? And so I think that's the biggest thing is you know, we, it even comes down to like the language that you choose and like how you talk about what you do. You know, I think we make a real effort to talk about our artists as partners, like not just acts on our roster, you know, that imply this like sense of like ownership or hierarchy. You know, we like the types of deals that we do with our artists, you know, often are built off of like a 50-50 profit split. You know, it's you know, it's different than like the major label model where they normally dump a lot of money on the table and then there's a ton of costs to recoup, and who knows if that artist ever sees a royalty check. Like, you know, we prefer to, you know, take this 50-50 model and cut royalties to our artists, you know, after a couple of years after their album comes out, right? Because it's recouped and it's profitable. So it really comes just to, yeah, to get on that wavelength for what they want.
That's great information. Like, yeah, that's super interesting. Those different kind of different models, and kind of I think that's an important distinction to make, kind of like how secretly being independent, how it's different. We've definitely had some people from major labels, and yeah, the process just seems different. I think I'll do one more question from this list or so, and then I'll make sure that anybody who's in the meeting can ask a question personally if they want. And then if not, I'll jump back to this list of questions.
Cool.
But yeah, I going through these questions, I saw a lot of, you know, people, this is their major, this is what they're interested in, and they're interested to see if there's a role for this kind of job in the music industry, such as like a creative director or PR or a financial analyst. And then going off of that, what kind of role or job is most needed in the music industry right now?
Yeah, I mean, most needed is a tough one to answer, just because there's so many different angles to it. And again, being sort of a niche industry, you know, I'd say that like as music in the tech world become more deeply intertwined. I do think people who have a comfort with data, you know, and you know, are excited about devoting their time to that has become more and more important. You know, I mean, we at this point, you know, have a couple, I mean, their titles are slightly different, but they're essentially like streaming data analysts, you know, that we have on staff, that's what they do, you know. And you know, but I think beyond that, like I know so many people who have very different career paths than mine, where they've hopped around. You know, they've worked for digital music services, they've worked for a label, they worked for a publishing company, and so it's one of those things that like you can pick a spot to start, and there's still always potential for movement within the industry, right? Like, you know, and I think that, you know, particularly like someplace like we work, like I work, we actually like moving people around in between different departments sometimes if they have the interest to, because it kind of gives people a more holistic understanding of the business and makes them more well-rounded employees. But yeah, I mean, I guess so I answered the question, you know, so what does the music industry need? What was the other part of that?
Yeah. So the other one is kind of, is there a place for like a lot of different roles such as PR and these things that are like big titles in a major, but do they exist in the
Yeah.
music industry, like a creative director and stuff like that as well?
Yeah. So yes, you know, there are, you know, we have, you know, like a 10-person accounting staff, you know, we have like a 8-person legal department. You know, we have someone with the title creative director is maybe a little bit different than what I think people traditionally expect that to mean, but like our creative director kind of helps oversee both our art department, but also working with, you know, third-party creatives like video directors, photographers, things like that. But yeah, you know, there are positions like that within, you know, businesses like ours. You know, obviously we're a label of a certain scale. You know, if you're talking about like a 5-person operation, you know, you got people wearing lots of different hats. You know, which kind of goes back to like my earlier point about like take a few classes, like so you can, you know, kind of have those multidisciplinary skills. But you know, even outside of like that sense, like there are a lot of independent contractors and small businesses in the music industry. Like, yes, they're independent music PR firms, you know, who only work on records like we work with, you know, we have our legal department, you know, but yes, there are entertainment lawyers, you know, who work pretty much solely with musicians. You know, there are artist managers and business managers, finance managers, you know, designers, you know, I already mentioned, you know, video directors, engineers, you know, there's such a wide range. And so, you know, I think if there's a, you know, I think there are certain things that like all businesses need. You know, like we have an HR person, you know, like smaller label might not, but there are HR consultants for small labels who don't have someone on staff. And so I think that there are a lot of ways, you know, to take like a, you know, a major or specific, you know, specific path that isn't necessarily like preset for the music industry and to still apply it within.
Awesome. That's probably great to hear for a lot of people, knowing that we don't have a music business major here, but maybe one day. Yeah, no, that's great to hear. Well, awesome. I would love if anybody has questions and wants to ask them personally or throw them in the chat now, that would be great. If not, I can just kind of keep rolling down this list, but would love to hear from anybody in the current call if they'd like to. No pressure though. Okay, cool. No worries. Oh. Okay, here we go. We got a couple. First one is you hiring question mark. And then another one is to secretly employ any roles that involve management of artists or tour managing. So I think those are can be a little intertwined. I think you might be on mute.
Thank you. Yes, we are usually hiring. and I'll find the link to our jobs page and drop it in the chat here in a second once I find it. But yeah, I mean, I guess specifically on like the artist management and tour management side, that is not part of our business currently, but it was for a while. We did for about a 5-year period. We were partners in a company called Fort William Artist Management that worked with some artists that we worked with on the label side, but also others. And you know, so for a while, I had colleagues that were managers on the side. You know, ultimately, I think what made it a little bit tricky for us is it created some conflict of interest scenarios where, you know, when we are partnered with an artist, we represent the interests of the artist 100%, you know, but when we're trying to partner with an artist, you know, and you're negotiating a deal or, you know, negotiating terms and they're looking at other options they have, you know, we found that like having a foot in the management space sometimes created difficult conversations or decisions for us on the label side. And we decided to just kind of continue focusing more on the label side. But yeah, I'll drop in here. This is our jobs link. If anyone ever wants to check it out. I'll also mention too that not too far, I mean, maybe probably some of you are familiar, but Rhyme Sayers, longtime hip hop hit label, with roots in Minneapolis. We work with them now. We distribute them now, and I know that like while they have staff outside of Minneapolis, you know, I know they really enjoy being rooted there, and so that is at least like one professional opportunity kind of in our zone that's not too far away from you all. Yeah, look at this other question.
Yeah.
New policies between new artists and Spotify that can lead to a payola situation. Yeah, I think what this question is referring to is, you know, there's a program right now where Spotify will offer greater promotional resources behind a release on platform in exchange for lower royalty rates on the streams that promotion generates. We've experimented with that some. It's tricky because, you know, it's like, it's not true payola in that like we are paying out of pocket for, you know, a certain thing. But it's right on that edge, right? Like it's you know, it's kind of like I'm oversimplifying here, you know, but it's kind of like paying for extra ad impressions, you know, and having access to a better rate. I think we really have mixed feelings about it, right? Like I think that we've experimented with it to see what impact it actually had. Like you know, and we would not put full albums in. We just put like a song by an artist or a few artists in, so we compare how that song performed relative to other songs on the same album or in the same artist catalog. And you know, it's one of those things that like, as tough and challenging as the industry is right now, part of our obligation to artists is to at least investigate any opportunity to grow their careers and generate revenue for them, right? It's not just as simple as like, you know, 20, 25 years ago where you sell a bunch of CDs and that's it, you know, like touring is so much more important from a revenue standpoint, you know, publishing collections, you know, syncs in TV and film, commercials, things like that. And so we are kind of obligated to look at those things. But yeah, I guess the short answer is mixed feelings. I'm not sure if that's really something that's going to become a greater part of what we do, or if it kind of is just one of these things that like the music services try for a little bit and then it goes away. I will say that like there's a group called A2IM, which is a American Association of Independent Music, which is essentially like a lobbying body and like independent music resource organization that kind of speaks on behalf of American independent labels, and their tact and sort of responding to it has been highly critical at this point. I think there's a slippery slope with that sort of thing.
Do you think any of those programs have potential benefits to smaller artists that maybe aren't signed, say like Spotify Marquee or Discovery Mode? Or do you think that they could just potentially become a situation where, you know, the more money a larger label maybe has, then the more smaller artists get pushed down?
Yeah. The interesting thing with Marquee is that this, like, we actually tried to pitch we've had a couple of things in the Marquee program. We've pitched a couple things recently that they declined because they weren't big enough. We're talking about artists, you know, who have like, you know, 3 million monthly listeners on the platform, you know, songs with like 100 million plus streams, like fairly big artists for us. And so that feels like something that more and more is really just a way for Spotify to extract money out of the major labels, to be blunt. I think with Discover Mode, it can be a tool for smaller independent artists. I do worry, honestly, that it's just kind of shaking the loose change out of their pockets where there's not a lot to begin with, you know? We have the luxury of experimenting with it, you know, because of the resources that we have, and you know that it's not the only tool that we're using, but it's something I would maybe caution, you know, an independent artist on, you know, sort of putting too many eggs in that basket, right? Like experimenting is fine, but it's not something I would, you know, I would plan on devoting a lot of, you know, in this case, maybe not like direct capital, but like financial trade-off to.
Awesome. Yeah, that's super insightful. Cool. Well, we have about 5 minutes left. But yeah, this has been great so far. I'd love to get, if anybody else has any burning questions, that would be fantastic. Now would be the time. Otherwise, I'll probably leave it with the same question I asked most of our guests, which is if you could give one, or it can be more than one, but a major piece of advice to people that are looking to get into the music industry in any shape or form, you know, like what's one quality or one skill set or just one, you know, good tidbit of information that might help them in their kind of as they go through college and graduate and try to pursue this career.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I said earlier, you know, a comfort with change and always being willing to learn. You know, it's, you know, especially when, like, I'm like 41, when you get to like my age, it is a little tempting to kind of just like find a comfortable routine, you know, and I think it's important to not sort of fall into that trap. But I think like, and you know, I mean, this is like a major part of the college experience, but it's like find your people, like find who you like to be around and who challenges you, and who makes you excited to talk with or to do things with, and you know, that is probably going to be built into, you know, the type of artists you're going to want to work with, you know, and the type of job that'll be stimulating to you, you know. And I think just above all, I mean, this is kind of regardless of like our like secretly is like philosophy as a business, but everything operates at like the intersection of art and commerce. Like the commerce is important, right? Like we've got 200 employees, we've got all these artist partners, all these label partners with the distribution company. We are we have some responsibility to all of their livelihoods, right? Like the idea is that we don't, there shouldn't be a lot of starving artists, that people should be able to build a career and a life off of their art. Not everyone can do that, but that's what we want to try to do. So the commerce is important, but not at the cost of the art. And I think that just as you get deeper into it, if that's the path you go down, I think just making sure that you can still listen to a record and go to a show or whatever it might be and just still get joy from it, and not always have like work brain creeping in. Like music is a beautiful, special thing, and it's a major form of human expression. And I think as long as that is still like a major ingredient in what you're doing, that's what's gonna make it matter. So yeah.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much. That's an excellent note to end on. Well, we really appreciate you spending your time with us tonight. And yes, thank you so much. It's been great.
Yeah, no problem. And Nolan, I'll just mention real quick.
Yeah, totally.
Because someone asked me in a DM. Feel free to share my email address with anyone who is in the chat if they have like follow-up questions or anything specific they want to ask. I'm happy to follow up with folks.
Well, yeah, that's great to hear. And then do you have like a LinkedIn or other kind of thing like that?
Yeah, let me pull it up here real quick. And I'll drop that in the chat as well. Yeah, so there's my LinkedIn, and my email is really easy. It's just Nick at Secretly Group.
There
I got there early enough. I only have
yeah,
the first name.
So. First name basis there. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And yeah, thank you.
Sure thing. Thanks, y'all.